The palace thought the biggest royal scandal had already exploded, but according to chilling new claims, the real betrayal may have been happening silently behind closed doors the entire time. Because what if Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who survived wars, scandals, divorces, leaks, and generations of royal chaos, became so deeply suspicious of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle that she refused to speak to Harry alone? What if the Queen of England herself believed every private conversation could one day become public ammunition? And what if the royal family's growing fear was not paranoia at all, but preparation for something they secretly saw coming long before the world did? Picture the atmosphere inside those final years of the monarchy. Not the polished balcony smiles, not the carefully staged Christmas speeches. Behind palace walls, according to explosive revelations now emerging from a major royal biography, there was something far darker unfolding beneath the surface. A total collapse of trust between Queen Elizabeth II and the Sussex camp. And the detail that changes everything is almost painfully simple. But every time Prince Harry reportedly called the Queen, she allegedly made sure another person was physically in the room beside her. A witness, a protector, somebody who could later confirm exactly what had or had not been said. Think about the emotional weight of that for a second. This was not some distant politician. This was her grandson, the boy she once laughed with publicly. The grandson many believe she adored more softly than the others. Yet somehow, by the final stretch of her life, conversations had reportedly become so delicate, so potentially dangerous, that the monarch no longer trusted privacy itself. And suddenly, all those old rumors people once mocked began looking very different. Remember when whispers first appeared suggesting the royal family feared private moments were being documented? People laughed at it. Critics dismissed it as hysterical royal paranoia. But then came the interviews. Then came the Netflix series. Then came the memoir packed with deeply personal conversations, private text messages, family tensions, emotional arguments, intimate details the palace never imagined would become global entertainment. One by one, the exact fears people mocked slowly started materializing in public. That is what makes these latest revelations feel less like random gossip and more like a puzzle finally snapping together. And the Queen's reported behavior tells its own devastating story. According to accounts described in the biography, her responses during those calls became painfully restrained. Short answers, careful wording, minimal emotion. Yes, no. Tiny responses from a woman famous for reading every room with surgical precision. Imagine how tense those conversations must have felt. Imagine Harry on the other side of the line trying to speak naturally while somewhere deep inside the palace machine, alarms were already going off. Because this was no longer simply a family disagreement. This had become institutional survival. The monarchy operates on controlled image, protected conversations, invisible diplomacy. Once private exchanges begin appearing in documentaries, interviews, or books, the entire system starts panicking, and Queen Elizabeth understood systems better than almost anyone alive. But the most haunting part may be what happened when Harry and Meghan reportedly brought their daughter to meet the Queen. A moment that should have been emotional, warm, deeply personal, yet even then, according to the claims, another palace aide remained inside the room, and the Queen reportedly refused requests for a professional photograph. Why? That single decision says more than any public statement ever could. Because royal photographs are power. Royal photographs are symbols. And if the Queen declined one during such an important family meeting, then somewhere beneath the politeness sat hesitation, caution, maybe even fear about where those images might eventually end up. Then came the sentence that hit palace watchers like an earthquake. According to the biography, the Queen privately questioned Harry's decision to leave royal duty behind, allegedly remarking, and for what? To be a carer for Archie. Brutal, quietly brutal, not shouted, not emotional, just devastatingly cold in the way only disappointed family members can be. Because to Queen Elizabeth, duty was oxygen. She sacrificed literally everything for it. Privacy, freedom, personal opinions, even grief. She believed the institution always came first. So watching Harry abandon that structure for California life reportedly confused her on a level deeper than the public ever realized. And suddenly the timeline starts looking terrifyingly different. The warnings before the wedding, the reported hesitation from senior royals, Prince Philip's alleged skepticism, King Charles urging caution, the Queen herself reportedly advising Harry to slow down before marriage. All those little fragments people ignored now look like flashing warning lights buried in plain sight. Because according to this portrait emerging now, the palace did not suddenly lose trust overnight. The erosion began years earlier, quietly, carefully, behind those giant palace doors where smiles are rehearsed and silence is weaponized. What makes this even more emotionally explosive explosive is that Queen Elizabeth reportedly remained mentally sharp almost until the final hours of her life, despite Martin attempts by some commentators to suggest otherwise. Witnesses described her memory as extraordinary, her wit intact, her awareness razor sharp. Even days before her death, she was reportedly joking about revolving doors with prime ministers after receiving Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. That line matters because it destroys the image some people now try to paint of a confused, fading monarch disconnected from reality. No, according to those closest to her, she saw exactly what was happening around her, which makes her caution around Harry and Meghan even more chilling because it suggests these were conscious, calculated decisions made by a fully aware queen protecting the crown to the very end. But if you think the Harry and Meghan tension was the most explosive part of these revelations, wait until you understand what this book quietly exposes about the emotional collapse happening inside the palace during the Queen's final years. Because underneath the carefully controlled royal image, there was another war unfolding. A war over history itself. A war over memory. A war over who would control the truth once Queen Elizabeth II was gone. And according to these accounts, the Queen understood that danger long before the public did. Look closely at the timing of everything. While the palace was trying to preserve dignity and silence, the modern media machine was turning royal pain into global streaming content. Private text messages suddenly appeared on screen. Family tensions became entertainment. Emotional wounds became monetized storytelling. And from the perspective of Buckingham Palace, this was not just embarrassing, it was existential. Because the monarchy survives on mystery. The crown survives because not everything is explained. The moment every disagreement becomes content, every private conversation becomes a future documentary scene, the entire illusion of royal control begins collapsing in public view. That is why the Queen's behavior reportedly became colder, more careful, more guarded. She was not merely dealing with family disappointment anymore, she was dealing with what looked like the complete destruction of royal confidentiality itself. And what makes this story even darker is the realization that Prince Philip reportedly saw these dangers too. Long before streaming platforms turned royal family trauma into billion-dollar content, Philip already understood how dangerous fictionalized storytelling could become. That is why the revelations surrounding the crown hit so hard. According to Hugo Vickers, Philip was reportedly furious over how one of the deepest traumas of his life had been twisted into dramatic fiction for television. And when you hear the real story, the anger suddenly makes perfect sense. As a teenager, Philip lost his beloved sister Cecile in a horrifying plane crash alongside her husband, children, unborn baby, and multiple family members. An entire branch of his family wiped out in one catastrophic moment. It was the kind of trauma that scars a human being forever. But according to these revelations, the dramatized television version twisted the tragedy into something almost unrecognizable, inventing scenes where Philip's own father supposedly blamed him for the death. Imagine carrying grief like that your entire life only to watch millions of strangers consume a fictionalized version of it as entertainment decades later. Suddenly, Philip's fury stops sounding like royal arrogance and starts sounding heartbreakingly human. And this is where the entire story starts connecting in terrifying ways. Because the palace's fear was never just about gossip. It was about narrative control. Once private suffering leaves palace walls, it no longer belongs to the family. It belongs to the world. It gets reshaped, reinterpreted, repackaged. And Queen Elizabeth, perhaps more than anyone alive, understood how dangerous that process could become. That is why she reportedly stayed silent so often. That silence was not weakness. It was survival strategy. She had learned over 7 decades that once words escape into public life, they mutate beyond recognition. What makes these final revelations so emotionally devastating is the portrait they paint of the Queen herself away from cameras. Not some cold robotic monarch, not some distant untouchable figure, but an intensely observant woman who remembered everything. Tiny details, forgotten conversations, historical parallels from decades earlier. People who met her reportedly walked away stunned by how mentally sharp she remained deep into old age. She could recall obscure names, old political moments, tiny facts nobody expected her to remember. And that level of awareness changes everything because it means she fully understood the emotional fracture happening around her family near the end. There is something deeply deeply haunting about the image of the queen during those last months. Frail physically, yes, but mentally alert enough to see the monarchy entering a completely different era, an era where cameras no longer stayed outside palace gates, where family members themselves became media producers, where silence lost power because streaming platforms rewarded exposure instead. She belonged to a generation that believed dignity meant restraint, but suddenly she found herself surrounded by a world rewarding revelation, confession, emotional oversharing, public vulnerability. Two completely different philosophies colliding headfirst inside one family. And maybe that is why the reported quote about Harry opting out hits so brutally hard. Because beneath the criticism sat genuine confusion. Queen Elizabeth spent her entire existence sacrificing personal freedom for duty. Every Christmas speech, every handshake, every appearance, every carefully neutral expression. Her entire identity became service to the institution. So when Harry walked away from that system and transformed royal life into public storytelling, she reportedly could not fully understand it. To her generation, duty was identity. To the modern generation, identity itself became the product. But perhaps the most emotionally explosive detail of all is what these stories quietly reveal about loneliness at the top of monarchy. Think about it. Queen Elizabeth ruled for over 70 years. She met presidents, prime ministers, dictators, celebrities, revolutionaries. She survived wars and constitutional crises. Yet in the end, according to these accounts, one of her greatest emotional burdens became uncertainty over her own grandson's private conversations. That is almost Shakespearean in its sadness. The most powerful woman in British history spending her final years measuring words carefully during family phone calls because trust itself had become fragile. And still, even with all that tension, the Queen apparently never lost her discipline, never publicly exploded, never retaliated emotionally, never unleashed the kind of fury many people in her position might have. Instead, she reportedly did what she had always done. She protected the institution quietly, carefully, methodically, even when it hurt personally. That is what makes her final image so powerful. Not perfection. Control. Extraordinary control.